So just a quick summary of some of the things that I've learned and been burned by in Flow. Jamie inspired me a little bit when he said he was going to do trigger conditions. So I just came up with a list of some things that I wanted to share. So I'll just go through the different pages here. So the first one is don't make a flow process a whole lot of records. This may seem logical at first, but one of the devs that I know was used to writing these great big legacy programs, and in C# where he would pull in a list of 10,000 records and then process all those records. That doesn't translate well into Flow. So instead of having a query at the beginning of your flow that goes into a loop to try to process thousands of records at a time, a better option is to have a flow that will trigger child flows across all of those records that you need to process. So this is just a little picture of a little flow that we were working on the other day, and it just had a whole lot of steps. Like I say, the first time in, this was processing, this use case was a zip code import, and they were trying to do salespeople alignments. And so for each zip code, there was 10 different sales territories records. So there was contacts, 10 contact fields, something to that effect, or 12 or 15. Any rate, the point is that it would kick off and it would try to update all the records, 40,000 of them, because there's 40,000 zip codes every time this thing went off, and the flow would just die. So not a happy thing. What we did was we imported the 40,000 records to a temp table and then kicked off 40,000 flows to run. So that worked a little better, marginally better. Then we hit the API limits. But then another thing we learned from that was within our master flow, we had repeating patterns. So we said, enough of that. Why try to pack it all into one flow? Why don't we make child flows out of this? So the lesson learned there is you can use a manual trigger on a flow and pass parameters into it, and then do the things you need to do and return control back to the main program. So this long flow here you see with each of these gray conditional blocks, depending on if there's values, it would call this one set of code. So instead of having all this built into the big one, we just called the same one flow to do it. We just passed in the parameters we need to do stuff. Seems logical when you think about it. Whoops, sorry. Something that catches a lot of people I've read on forums is they use the apply to each. They do a list query, for example, against Common Data Service, Dataverse, whatever the name is this month, and the apply to each, and then they try to use a variable inside of that apply to each. Well, the problem is that out of the box, it tries to run that apply to each to every record in parallel like this. So it's like coming down through your flow, and then it runs all of these at the same time. And that's not a thing that you want to do with a variable inside the apply to each, because if the variable's value is different for each one of these, then you end up getting different values and you get some unusual responses. So under the three dots in apply to each, there's this thing called concurrency control. And you'll actually find that in a lot of these different controls, control actions in Flow, you have this concurrency control where if you're seeing some odd behavior, you could turn this on, change the degree of parallelism down to 1, and that will force it to behave as though they're all linear. Just do the first one, then the second, then the third, and so on until it gets through the list. The next thing is when you're updating a row in Common Data Service, Dataverse, I really need to update the slides, I guess. updating a row with a lookup. Whoops, I'm sorry. I keep hitting the roller on my mouse. Here, I'll lock it. If you're trying to update a lookup, you could run into some problems. And you may have seen this where you get this error message result, resource not found for segment. And so basically what happens is, say, for example, I'm in an account and I want to update the parent account. And you're using a lookup field from another place. Well, first of all, it has to be in a specific format. You can't just drop the field in like you did in classic workflows. But again, you can't just put in /accounts, open parentheses in the field in here either, because if that value that you're bringing in from somewhere else is null, then it would be an invalid expression. So if I've set up this this example flow where I did a compose to put together the syntax so that it would look correct, and then the field that came from the output of another step, and then in the actual flow in updating the account, I have an if statement, and it's just testing to see if that resulted in a string greater than 32 characters, then it would go ahead and output that compose into the field. So, and if it's less than 32 characters, that means then there was no value in here, and therefore it should put in a null. And that would save you from getting errors when trying to update lookup fields for values for fields that may be coming in as blank values. I've seen some people try to do this with if blocks and multiple updates, and it gets kind of messy. So just putting the if inside here saves you some effort. There is this ability. So something you can't do with this is you can't clear the lookup field. So you have to use an unrelate action to do that. Here I'm showing a picture of a flow where I have a relate and an unrelate based on a set of conditions. But something I'm really not happy about with this, and maybe if somebody in this august group knows better, the only way I found to deal with that was to soft code the service root URL as part of it, because it asked for the full URL to the environment where you're trying to relate or unrelate the records. So I used an environment variable in my environment because I still want to promote my flow without having to worry about did I carry the right URL. And I'm sorry, if you don't know what I'm talking about, ask me later. I don't have a lot of time to get into the details of environment variables and how this should look, but it's basically an https:// whatever your environment.crm.dynamics.com/v9/ whatever. It's a big URL that goes in front of all this. So the problem that I was trying to solve here at any rate was if you promote the flow and you hard coded this service root URL in here and you promote the flow, then this is trying to unrelate records in a different environment. So Microsoft, I think, slipped on a banana peel here when they asked us to put this in, and yet this is an object that's in the current environment. Moving on. So if you exceed too many API calls, and this is something I was alluding to earlier, consider using a JSON cache. So what I'm talking about here is I had a list of contacts that had an email address, and I needed to be able to look up that email address many times during this alignment of data. And it was hitting the system thousands of times just to go find, look up an email to go find a contact GUID. So what I did was I ran a query against those contacts, and I pulled out just their email and their GUID. I have a fetch XML behind this, and I dump it into a file, a JSON file, in my local OneDrive. Or I shouldn't say local, it's OneDrive up in Azure. And so then other processes that need to look up those contact records can then just go pull that recent copy of the cache to go look up the contacts. So I have another little process that will call this to update the cache periodically as needed. But then any processes that need to look up contact can just pull off that JSON file and save themselves a lot of effort from not having to go through the API. And let's see, the next one is don't count on the trigger to have all the fields. So this one I've learned kind of the hard way. It works a lot of the time. Like I just deployed a flow last week, and I have a trigger condition, and I had a step further down in the process that used a field from the trigger condition. Everything worked great in development. Everything worked great in staging and UAT. We promoted to production and it failed. And it said that the field had no value. It was null. And that wasn't true. It actually did. So I solved that problem by saying, okay, I'll just go get the record that triggered this in the first place, which did bring in the field, and then I would use that in the subsequent steps in the flow. There's an added benefit to doing this, and that is that you're separating the environment that triggered this from the flow that actually has to do the work. So now imagine that you've built this flow, it's 20, 30 steps, and it's all based off of this go get the account record instead of the trigger itself. Now, if you wanted to replace that trigger with something else, like a timed event or something, a manual button push, or turn this into a child flow, you can easily replace this trigger event with a different trigger event without disrupting the rest of the flow that you've built behind it. Let's see. And this is what Jamie was just talking about, using filters and trigger conditions. And I went through a little bit of an exercise to come up with a list of all the triggers. I went through all the documentation in Flow and found all of the different ones that had triggers, found some really interesting triggers in here. Ones that I was kind of enamored with and I've used a few times before is, of course, manually triggering a flow can be used for the head or the trigger event for a child flow. But there's this other one called when an HTTP request is received, and that will give you a HTTP URL endpoint so that you can have other services call your flow and run it. So if you have a portal or if you have some other external service and you want to push some data into your CRM system, this would be one that you could use. There's some pretty obvious ones. I discovered one, Bing search is in here. You can set up a query criteria, and then whenever that query criteria hits a Bing news article, it could send you an email or take some action, which I thought was kind of cool. MSN has a weather trigger in here, so as weather conditions change, you could have that right down to a file. I have a client who's a museum. They want to know about weather changes because it affects how many people they're going to put on staff. Office 365 has a bunch of different triggers. It's interesting, they're named different things. Like one is called Office 365 for Outlook. Another one is called Outlook Tasks. Another one is called Outlook.com. So it's a little, Outlook.com is different. That's going to be a live credential versus these guys, which is going to be a Active Directory credential, but they're very similar in that they trigger on when email arrives, when events are updated, and so on. And then some other ones out there, YouTube, like if the system finds a new YouTube video that's created that matches your search criteria, just like with Bing News, it could tell you about it. So that's it. Quick roundup on some best practices and some triggers. Any questions?
I do have a question, and it is it's in regards to the child flow, right? So we all should love child flows because it gives you the ability to kick as John Lou said, it's the one flow to control them all. But the one thing that I've encountered lately is the flow that controls content type workflow. So in the old days, we had reusable workflows and it was content typing. So with the content type in 2010, 2013, it would do its job. But in the new world, that does not happen anymore. And so I've been using child flows to kind of go back to those tables and look for those conditions. Have you run across anything like that in your like everyday as far as like reusable workflows?
So yeah, well, child flows are a great way to reuse some logic that you've built. And I can't speak specifically to what your particular situation is, but that is exactly what I'm trying to do with the child flow is come up with a way to have some logic that you can use over and over again, like I was talking about back on way back earlier in this guy here.
Yes.
This was just doing nothing but associate or relate records or unrelate records. And rather than doing this same kind of bit over and over again in a massively long file, it was just easier to have a little bit of reusable code there that I could call over and over and just pass in the name of the field that I wanted to do the relationship with.
Okay. Jamie, solution, I'm sorry, child flows. Only way that I've seen a child flow is if it is in a solution.
Okay. Yeah, I know it's kind of technically available in standard, Aiden, but I think you can't send data out of a child flow.
You know, I jumped the gun because I saw all of the Power. So I was looking at Power Automate right now. I saw the Power Automate connector and all the ones create flow, delete flow, but that's all the management ones, not the actual invocation of a child flow. So I hit enter too soon on that one.
Yeah. I know it requires a solution, and I know you can use solutions without a premium license, but you're kind of hamstrung, I think, because you can't send data out of a child flow. But if I'm wrong, prove me wrong. From what I understand, that's the case. Anyway, no, this is awesome. Thank you, Nelson.
You're very welcome.